North Korea has made some major announcements. North Korea's President Kim Jong Un has said that building the nuclear force is the most important cause, adding that the new ICBM clearly proved to the world that North Korea is a full-fledged nuclear power and can stand against supremacy of the U.S. What are the reasons for his announcements, and how will the U.S. react hearing that, especially since Kim Jong Un has said that North Korean scientists have made a wonderful leap forward in technology for mounting nuclear warheads on ballistic missiles? Just a few of the topics and issues we'll be looking at in this edition of the Spotlight. First, let me introduce our guests. Richard Becker, anti-war activist, joins us from the Answer Coalition from San Francisco. Tony Gosling, investigative journalist, also joins us from Bristol. Welcome to you both. Tony Gosling, first to you. The North Korean leader Kim Jong Un saying that his country aims to have the world's most powerful nuclear force. He said that while celebrating the launch of this new intercontinental ballistic missile at a ceremony which some were surprised to see his daughter. Not that it wasn't known how important nuclear weapons are to North Korea. Why do you think this is coming at this time and it being displayed in the way that it is?
Well, let's cast our minds back 4 years or so to the Donald Trump era, where actually Kim Jong Un and Trump were embracing each other, and actually there was a rapprochement going on. Trump had basically cut through all of the diplomatic nonsense that the State Department, it's almost like a firewall really, with these bureaucrats at the deep state set up, and Trump had managed to cut through that in order to literally sit down with Kim Jong Un in North Korea and say, look, listen, you know, we can get along, we can start to trust each other from the presidential level down, you know, and that has all, it seems, been falling apart. But in the backdrop to all of this, I think we've got to just look at the nuclear weapons era after the Second World War, as the United States became initially the sole controller of nuclear weapons, and other countries then got on the nuclear bandwagon. Well, of course, it wasn't a bandwagon, because they realized that this was the weapon of the future, and anybody who had this weapon would be able to intimidate, you know, not only other countries but their own population into going along with various plans to do with possible wars. And so I think if you go back to 1956, where the British were attacked in Egypt and the Americans refused to help us, I think that was the right thing to do, actually, because it was the end of the colonial era. But the Americans at that point really started to on a plan for what was an attempt at world domination. And I think that we have to just be realistic about this. The Americans don't say this. They never say this in any official capacity. Right. But anyone that pays attention to world affairs knows that that's what the United States wants. And there's only one thing which will stop you being dominated by the United States, it seems. And other countries like Libya, etc., Iraq, etc., have realized this, and that is nuclear weapons are the only things the Americans understand. If you've got nuclear weapons, they won't attack you. But if you haven't, they may do, and at some point they probably will do. And so I think the Americans have actually made this situation for themselves by the combination of being the first major nuclear power, with Henry Kissinger putting the strategy forward to all this, and then also by having the unified command structure around the world where the US military attempts to dominate every inch of the planet. This is, I think, what's created the reaction from Kim Jong Un, and nothing else.
Well, taking a look at what our guest Tony Gosling said, Richard Becker, first of all, let's take a look at what this intercontinental ballistic missile is that Kim Jong Un is so raving about. It's called the Hwasong-17, dubbed the monster missile, believed to be capable of reaching the U.S. mainland. Now, given the fact that they are now in possession of this, what do you think the U.S. is actually thinking, or how should it react? Or at this point, is the fact that North Korea is capable of having and making this type of intercontinental ballistic missile mean that it's not even interested in any negotiations on its missile capabilities?
Well,
looks like we may have lost Richard Becker. Yeah, we did. Tony Gosling, so we talked about, Richard Becker, you're back. Yes, go ahead.
Yes. So, I do think that they are very interested in negotiations, but there have to be real negotiations. In 2018, there was the meeting in Singapore, which your other guest referenced, which looked like it could move toward the situation could move toward a breakthrough. But in Hanoi in 2019, that collapsed. The negotiations collapsed suddenly. And according to CNBC, the network here, it collapsed because Trump came into that meeting with a piece of paper and written in English and Korean, and saying that North Korea should turn over its weapons and its nuclear-grade fuel, weapons-grade fuel, to the United States. And that was it. That was the end of the agreement. Now, that was really, we believe, Bolton and Pompeo. Bolton's been a longtime advocate of exterminating North Korea altogether. He was asked once what his policy was in regard to North Korea, and he said, no North Korea. So you had those elements take over. And whereas in 2018, there was an agreement to limit or halt testing on the part of North Korea, if there was also an end to the so-called war games, which aren't really war games at all, by the U.S. and South Korea simulating invasions of North Korea. And this year, they were back at a very high level. That was in August. And they openly stated, the U.S. commanders openly stated that part of those military maneuvers, those war games, and you never know if they're games until they're over, but part of them was the assassination of Kim Jong Un, the leader of the country. The New York Times said he might have taken it personally. Well, no kidding. If the most powerful military in the world said, we're rehearsing to kill you or to assassinate you and to destroy your government, well, of course you have to understand what that really means. So that's the reality of the situation, is that what was at one time appeared to be a promising steps toward normalization of relations, an end to the war. There has never been an end to the Korean War, the U.S.-Korea War. It's an armistice agreement, and the North Koreans very much want an end to this status of war. They want a peace agreement with the United States, and they want a lifting of the economic sanctions, which have done so much damage to North Korea and the people of North Korea, as they have to so many other countries in the world.
I'm going to ask you the same question, Tony Gosling. I mean, we could take a look at the previous attempts that were made by the U.S. And North Korea in terms of trying to reach some kind of a deal. But aren't we looking at a new landscape now? I mean, we're looking at a landscape wherein Russia is somewhat disconnected from the West, in the matter of speaking. They're not really interested in the West, and they're shifted, really aligning themselves with China. Do you think North Korea is still very much interested in wanting some kind of a deal with the U.S. in particular for sanctions to be lifted, given the fact that, I'm guessing that China is one way or another backing North Korea?
Well, it's a very important point, yes. I mean, in a way, North Korea is just a kind of policy maneuver of China that it can do at arm's length. So it can, what they're doing through, I think, in North Korea is much of the things that the Chinese would like to say and like to do, but the Chinese are far, far more sensible, and they're trying to keep a good diplomatic relationship with the United States. But the US has caused so much trouble for itself by throwing its weight around and trying to, well, I mean, what they've done is they've used this economic warfare for the last 20 years to bully and badger various countries around the world. And what's been the result? Well, it's meant that the US is not trading with so many countries now that actually the US economy itself is collapsing. And the Chinese are doing very well out of this. I mean, they've got a very well-oiled and they've got actually quite quite a well-organized state in China, whereas the state in the US and in much of Western Europe is starting to collapse. The big corporations taking over, the government, basically finding it almost impossible to get in tax revenue because it's so weak. And so I think it's quite clear that, yes, the North Koreans do want to negotiate with the United States. But the thing is, as Vladimir Putin said, I think it was about 8 months, maybe a little bit longer ago now, the beginning of 2022, I heard him say something in one of his speeches along the lines of, well, the United States is not deal ready. This is a great expression because he's saying we can sit at the table with them all day, but we cannot actually get them to make a deal that they'll stick to. And they might even say something, but then they'll go away and they'll say, oh, we're very sorry, but our diplomats back in Washington have told us that we can't do this. So he's saying that to a certain extent, although they're always willing to sit down and talk to the United States, they're finding that they're basically banging their heads against a brick wall. And that is because the deep state in the US is in free fall, rather like the last days of Rome, when the Roman Empire was so corrupt on the inside that the various machines of diplomacy stopped working for the Romans, and of course their empire then stopped working. And I think we're seeing a similar sort of collapse with the US now. Many people would love to do deals with the United States, sensible, mature, adult deals, which would see all their people's successful growth of trade in the future, trusting relationships. But we've got a deep state in the US that doesn't want that to happen because it's afraid of its own position. What we've seen is that there's various problems at the centre of the US, not least of which has been revealed by the Epstein scandal. And these people are worried that if law and order breaks out in the international community, that the United States, the leaders of the deep state in the United States, the organised criminals basically, may be just going to jail or worse, maybe being executed. So they're fighting a rearguard action which is affecting their relationship with the entire world.
This is a very curious situation, Richard Becker, when you take a look at the landscape in that part of the world in terms of what the U.S. is doing. And my question to you is whether the U.S. does not want tensions to decrease. Now, when I say that, I mean the U.S. is busy trying to militarize. I shouldn't say trying to militarize the region. It's selling arms to the countries in that region, especially to the ones that are allied to it. Now, one of the main reasons it's doing that is, aside from North Korea, is the ultimate goal of China, because we know obviously the U.S. has a focus on China. And it does not want tensions then to be reduced because it could continue with these arms sales like it did with Japan. Japan said that I'm going to quadruple my defense spending. I'm going to buy all these missiles, especially howitzers, I think, which reach deep inside mainland China. It wants to keep that at that level because it's going to somewhat be preparing not only itself, but its allies in the region to confront China ultimately. Do you think that that's the correct way of looking at it?
Well, I think that there's no question that the pivot to Asia, as it was called, is aimed first and foremost at China. But North Korea also has an important role now, and the relations between them are strong, it appears, as they are between North Korea and Russia. And Russia and China, but particularly China, is the main target of the pivot to Asia and this huge buildup, which has seen vast deployment of U.S. military forces, increased military forces. There were already vast forces there in the Indo-Pac Command, as they call it, the Pacific Command, and this is an important factor in this. And the military buildup in Japan is also worth noting. Korea used to be was for decades a colony of Japan, and now the right wing and the militarists in Japan, they find it intolerable that they don't have nuclear weapons when their former colony does. North Korea being half of what that former colony was. And that's a big issue in Japan among the right wing. And this process continues, the military buildup on the part of, and nuclear buildup on the part of Korea, the pressures inside Japan grow for Japan to become also a nuclear power. The U.S. does not want Japan to become a nuclear power. It wants Japan to continue to be subordinate to the United States. And Japan is occupied. The occupation of Japan has never ended since the end of World War II. Tens of thousands of troops are all over Japan and Okinawa, as well as other bases in the area, but particularly Japan and Okinawa are key bases for the U.S. Military strategy in regard to Asia and its strategy of domination of Asia and global domination.
That's a very good point that you're making there. Since you mentioned China and Russia, Tony Gosling, I'm looking at a couple important points there on China. One of them, which involves Russia also, is that the U.S. says that both Russia and China have the ability to have leverage on North Korea to stop them from conducting these tests, and it wants to see Russia and China do that. It's not as if you've been hosting Russia and China in such a cordial, warm manner. You know, right. when you then come out and make a, I don't want to say demand, but asking both of them to do that. Why should Russia and China do that for the U.S.?
Well, they're not going to, I don't think, because actually what Kim Jong Un is doing is serving a very useful purpose, particularly for the Chinese. I mean, he is saber rattling for the Chinese, I think it's fair to say. The Chinese would much rather not be, you know, going for any confrontation. And we'll see that at the moment there are all sorts of domestic problems the Chinese have got to cope with demonstrations against the continued lockdowns and this sort of thing going on within China. It's serving, I think, a useful purpose, and it's very unlikely. When I say a useful purpose, I mean countering the bullying of the United States effectively, and saying, well, look, you know, if you can play at this game of making nuclear threats, so can we. And although the United States isn't necessarily making those on CNN, what it's doing is it's moving its forces closer to China, and it's surrounding China. It's threatening to blockade China, basically, by its military maneuvers. But I think that where the solutions might come to all of this, we need to look closely at, there are high-level connections between the United States and China, which very rarely get talked about. There was a very good discussion about all this recently by James Corbett and Whitney Webb, two very good freelance journalists who I'm sure some of your viewers will know, looking at the connections between the two. Now, this is a kind of deep state connection between the US and China. And so I think if there is going to be any dropping of these tensions, and of course, if that happens, that what we'll see is less saber rattling from Kim Jong Un and less saber rattling from the United States, maybe even some US troops going home from places like Japan we were just hearing about, and in other places in the Pacific, and that's where this should start. But of course, there is also a very important party in all of this, and that is the arms lobby. The arms lobby are pushing so much of US policy. They are very, very close to, obviously, the military, the State Department, and the US government. And they are the people, I think, that are pushing all these saber rattling and the tension, because they will simply make money out of any kind of conflict. Although, you know, many people think, well, we don't want a war. Why does anyone want a war? The arms lobby love wars. I hate to tell you, but they do, because they make a fantastic amount of money at it. And right. In the United States, they have the ear of Congress. They have the ear of President Biden. And the sorts of fear-mongering that the arms lobby come out with, I'm afraid, is the talk of the president and other people that talking about China and North Korea as a big threat, actually pushing their armed forces closer to these countries. And that is actually the arms lobby speaking. It's not the democratic people of the United States by any means.
Well, but to what degree is this, I guess, U.S. military going to go, even though they're interested, as our guest there said, the arms lobby is interested in these conflicts when we're talking about nuclear conflicts? I mean, Richard Becker, taking a look at what's happening in Ukraine vis-a-vis Russia. So you have a nuclear armed country there that the U.S. and Russia have exchanged statements amongst each other, with Russia at least proposing the idea of perhaps the use of nuclear weapons, even though it has said on many occasions that it's not going to do that. Or when it comes to the case of North Korea, of which the U.S. has also, in reaction, for example, gone ahead and has its B-52 bombers, for example, flying over. Even China itself has nuclear bombs. And also looking at the region in West Asia, or the Middle East, as some call it, its ally, Israel, that has nuclear bombs. I mean, these are tensions around the world involving nuclear weapons. And the common denominator here is the U.S.
That's right. And, you know, it's not that China wants to rule the world or North Korea wants to rule. That's not true. But it is true that the United States wants to rule the world. I mean, it's the policy, the national security strategy changed in 2018 to one of away from the war on terrorism, so-called, to major party competition or major party conflict. It's clear what that means. You know, and we have to remember when in the longer term context that it was in February, I believe, of 2002 that Bush gave his infamous speech and the State of the Union, and it talked about the axis of evil. And it was a ridiculous speech, but very threatening to those who were the target, mainly the axis of evil being Iran, Iraq, and North Korea. Iran and Iraq had a war, an 8-year war with each other. They weren't exactly allies, and neither were allies. They might have friendly relations, but not allies with North Korea. And then what happened? Iraq was destroyed. Its state destroyed, and it remains destroyed today by the U.S. And then we have Libya was persuaded to give up its weapons programs, turn them over to the U.S., and then Libya was destroyed. So it was after the destruction of Iraq in the second Iraq War, U.S.-Iraq War, that North Korea resolutely set out that we're going to have a nuclear program, we're going to have nuclear weapons. They had been doing research before, but that really triggered the decision to go forward, we believe, and that is understandable. If you can't be able to respond to your adversary and your adversary is threatening your existence, well, you have a big problem. And so, you know, I think that's the context we have to see this in, is that it has been, as you said, the common denominator being the U.S. and its vast nuclear weapons program. I should also add, North Korea probably has 40 nuclear weapons at this point, maybe a little bit more than that. They can develop 6 or 7 a year. The United States has over 6,000 nuclear weapons and can destroy the entire planet with its nuclear arsenal in case of war. And that's where the great threat comes from in terms of nuclear weapons and what they can do to humanity and to the world that we live in.
Indeed, and that's something that obviously is taken notes with countries that the U.S. accuses of pursuing nuclear weapons, which one of them could be Iran, that is not trying to in any shape or form pursue a nuclear weapon, but is going after civilian nuclear program. Now, Tony Gosling, in closing, you know, when you talk about the U.S. wanting to be a superpower and pretty much all over the world, as our guest there said, and I think you mentioned that in some sense, why is the U.S. on that track? It's not successful. It can't even control. I just looked it up real quick, a Google search in Washington, D.C., where it has the highest crime rate. If you can't control your own state, how are you going to control the world?
Well, we have exactly the same problem here in the UK. The government has made a total mess of domestic policy. We've got poverty going through the roof, homelessness going through the roof. And so what they always do is they focus on foreign policy. This is just a distraction, effectively, from the complete failures of them to run their own economies. And, you know, slapping, the biggest example is the oil companies holding the government in Europe and the United States to ransom, jacking up energy prices, which makes nuclear power actually more viable and just about viable, as they're price fixing upwards all of the fossil fuels, saying they're doing something green, but what they're really doing is just helping the nuclear industry. And so I think, well, you know, you have to also remember that I think it was the Grey Zone, one of these websites recently, is alleging that actually Zelensky in Ukraine has been helping the North Koreans Ukrainians over the years to get their nuclear weapons program, because of course the Ukrainians had a lot of ex-Russian nuclear weapons.
I got to unfortunately jump in.
So
we're just fresh out of time. I'm so sorry about that, Tony Gosling.
Between the Ukrainians and North Korea too.
Sorry about that. We're just fresh out of time. Tony Gosling, investigative journalist. Thank you. Richard Becker, anti-war activist, Answer Coalition from San Francisco. With that, we come to an end for this edition of The Spotlight. Thanks for tuning in. Until the next Spotlight, it's goodbye.